Hey now, Brawlers, it's time for another Board Game Brawl review with Nick Minahan, sponsored by BoardGameBliss.com. Hey people, today we're going to take a look at the Space Dandy Galactic deck building game from 7 Seas Games. Now you might know the name 7 Seas if you're into anime and manga. Did I just pronounce anime as anime? Whatever. 7 Seas has been distributing manga in the US, translating and putting out over here for quite some time. I think at least 10 years at this point. I've read several of their titles back when I used to really be into manga at a certain point. But they've actually partnered now with Ninja Division, which is the parent company of Sodapod Miniatures, to put out more and more games based off of known anime. Now, Ninja Division has done Super Dungeon Explorer and other games that are anime themed, like the artwork and style is like that, but they're not actually based off of specific anime. Space Dandy is, and there will be more like Tokyo Ghoul coming out in the future. Also, that's why Funimation Animation is on the box somewhere too. So there's sort of a co-conspirator in this. Now, what this game is, by the way, if you're not familiar with the anime, I'm really not either. I read a little bit up on it, and I watched a couple of clips online, but I haven't actually seen the show in its entirety. But it's basically 13 episodes, anthology series. There's a Space Dandy who's kind of like a bounty hunter type character who wrangles up aliens, but the show looks like it's very tongue-in-cheek. I mean, there's a picture of the Statue of Liberty's head with a ball gag in his mouth, so that should give you some indication of how silly this show is. Definitely not to be taken too seriously. And maybe one day I'll actually watch it. But in any case, what you're doing mechanically in the game is traditional deck building, but with a few extra twists. You're actually trying to capture aliens like you would do in the show, and sock them away for points called Wulong in this game. And there's also combat between players to a certain degree, so on and so forth. Let me go ahead and give you a brief look at how the game is played, then we're going to come back and let you know what I think. The Space Dandy Galactic deck building game is a competitive game for 2 to 4 players. The goal is to have the most Wulong, that is, victory points, by the end of the game, which is acquired by registering aliens. The end of the game occurs when Gogol Empire cards equal to 1 plus the number of players are destroyed. Every player gets a game board on which they will place their Space Dandy. Each player's Space Dandy is exactly the same, just with different artwork. They don't really do anything, but you need to protect them. More on that later. This game uses traditional deck building rules in that you start with inferior cards, purchase better ones that go into your discard pile, and eventually reshuffle and use the latter. In this case, players start with 7 QTs, which give you 1 star point when played, which is the currency of the game. These are actually an example of cards with hand abilities, which are used immediately from hand and discarded. There are actually physical stars that come with the game to remind you of how much you accumulate, and in rare circumstances to denote other things on particular cards. Stars are used to purchase cards, and also you must spend 2 stars to attack your opponents with planet-side cards. You also start with 3 meows, which are worthless in your hand, but they can be played down planet-side for defense or offense. What's that, you say? Planet side, yes. On your player board, there is an area with room for 5 cards. All cards that have a star rating in the top corner can be played planet side, and you'll want to do this to protect your Space Dandy and to attack your opponents. Some cards have specific planet side abilities they can activate instead of attacking. A central board called the Orbit board is where random main deck cards will be placed for purchase. The cost in stars is the star rating in the top corner. Some rare cards have orbit abilities, which have an effect while they're on this board before being purchased. It could be anything from giving you discounts on other cards on the board or blocking you from purchasing them at all. Cards here are immediately replaced when purchased. There are several types of cards. Crew cards have special abilities and can usually be played both from your hand and down planet side. Effects cards are always just played from hand for their ability and then immediately discarded. Alien cards are actually the central focus of the game. Functionally, they are just like crew. You either play them for their hand ability or play them planet side to attack, defend, or use their abilities. However, instead of doing all of that, at the start of your turn, when you draw them, you may choose to permanently place them on your board's arc space. You may no longer use them at this point, but if they're still there when the game ends, they'll be worth their Wulong points, which is the number at the bottom of the card. Let's go back to attacking for a moment. Each crew or alien you have planetside can attack one of your opponent's units once per turn. Their star rating must equal or exceed their target star rating, and you must pay 2 stars for every attack. If you do this, the opposing creature is permanently destroyed and removed from the game. If your opponent has any crew or aliens planetside, you must target them first until they're all gone. Then, you may target the Space Dandy, which is relevant for 2 reasons. First, if successful, your opponent must permanently remove their topmost alien from their arc stack, if any. Then, they must place their Space Dandy on top of their deck. They'll have to draw it and play it back to the board on their next turn. You might be wondering when this game ends. I know I was. Shuffled into the large main deck are 8 Gogol Empire cards, which are all the same but with different artwork. When they come out of the deck, they don't go to the orbit board, but rather get played on the table between players. Any player may use them on their turn to attack their opponents, as if it was on their planet side. They can also be attacked directly by anyone. If destroyed, they're put off to the side, where you'll keep track of them. When one of these, plus the number of players, are destroyed, the game ends at the end of that round, at which point everyone adds up their Wulong, and whoever has the most is the winner. This game is shockingly bad. Like, I understand I'm really into deck building games, so I'm going to be a harsher critic of them than most. And because I like anime in general, but I don't have any attachment to the show that this is based on, I'm not going to be able to give it any kind of leeway in that regard. So I understand those things. But really, taking myself out of those roles, I still think this is a really bad game, and most people will think so as well, who at least have experience with any kind of card game. I think even if you're a fan of Space Dandy, you're going to have some issues with this one. But let's start from the beginning and go over it. Component-wise, I think that's probably the only either positive or neutral thing about the game. It looks okay. They use still shots from the anime, but for the most part, it looks decent. Everything is legible and clear to read. When I say that about a game and make a point of that, that probably means the rest of the game is not that good. But I will give it a point in its favor that it has boards for... each player has a board to put the planet-side cards out and your Space Dandy and the Arc. And there's the central board for the Orbit as well, which doesn't seem like a big deal, except that I've played many card games, including other deck-building games, that rely on not only a center row, but you doing lots of spatial things with your... side of the table, like cards have to go here, here's a separate pile for this, and then your discard pile, and then your deck, and they don't even bother to give you a board or anything like that. They say, oh, you can buy our separate playmat. So I will give Space Dandy, the game, a point in its favor for actually having those boards in there, and they're nice. The card quality is nice. There are the stars, which are cool, but they're mostly useless. There's a few cards that require you to say, okay, stow away points on this card, and then you can do something with them later. Like, if there's a card that banks them, there's a card that increases its power by having them on them, and so on. But other than that, they're completely useless. The game says, okay, anytime you play a card that gives you star points, collect stars. But you're going to just get rid of them. Even if you don't use them, they're gone. No other deck building games, like Dominion doesn't have gold coins in it because you don't need to. You should be able to do that simple math and keep track of it. So that lends me to think like, oh, maybe this is aimed at a younger audience, but I don't think so. I think it's just like they wanted to put them in there. So okay, that's not really a devastating complaint. But let's get to the devastating complaints. Now, I was actually eager to try this once I actually busted it out and was going through the rules, because I'm like, oh, okay, I was really worried it was just super bland, generic deck building game with nothing interesting about it. But then I was like, oh, okay, you got to stock away these enemies, the aliens that you can get for points, and that's an interesting thing. And then you're putting cards planet side, so when they're planet side, you can't use their other ability. So that kind of stuff is interesting. You can fight the other players. I'm like, okay, this is different. I like where they're going with this. Problems. First off, battle side or planet side attacking usually amounts to nothing. It is just a way to, I think, distract you. Yes, you can take out your Space Dandy, take out your opponent's Space Dandy, and make them lose one of their aliens. But there's so many ways around that. You don't have to have like a ton of cards planet side. Usually it doesn't help you to do so. You can usually get away with just putting your meows out there and the basic cards that you start off with, and then using a lot of other cards to pump them up and do lots of other stuff. I mean, it that whole section, rather than feel like something strategic and involved, just feels like a total distraction. And then that kind of leads me into one of my biggest complaints about the game was just there's no balance in the game whatsoever. There are cards in this game that are complete devastating bombs, and they're like 3 or 4 stars to buy. And some of those have to do with the planet side, which is why I brought it up now. Because you can put out an enemy that just says, oh, okay, it's only 6, and 6 isn't that hard to get. It's like one of the most expensive cards in the game. But you get it very early on. It's not too hard. And you can just wipe out all of your opponent's troops for 2 stars. Oh, okay. There's a lot of cards like that. There's other cards that say, when this is out planet side, basically, your other troops can never be attacked. Only this one can ever be. And then you can easily just do stuff to it to make it invincible. So the whole planet side thing just seems like a dog and pony show. It just seems pointless. And in the meantime, most of the cards that you have, you'd rather use their hand abilities. Like, why would I give this up by putting it planet side? So that's just a huge distraction. The whole thing with putting the aliens away, that works fine. But again, that just feels like, oh, well, okay. Let me not get ahead of myself. The reason why that doesn't work so well is actually leading into one of the bigger problems I have with the game, which is how the game ends. There are these Gogol Empire cards that are just randomly throughout the deck. Book doesn't tell you to seed the deck with them in certain spots. The only thing it says is you use a certain amount of them depending on the number of players. 2 plus the number of players, or 1 plus the number of players, I think. One of those 2. And then you just shuffle them in, and that's it. I'm sorry, let me correct myself. It's not that you shuffle that many in, it's that when that many come out, number of players, I think, plus 1, that's when the game ends. You put all the Gogol Empire cards in and then just hope that they come out. That's a big problem, because the stack of cards is huge. You have no idea if they're all going to be at the bottom, or if they're all going to be crowded at the top. And the more players that you have, the worse it is, because now you need more of them to come out before the game can end. This leads to an incredibly long slog of a game. Of you just like, even if you're quite far ahead, which is very easy to do because the game has no balance, you just have to sit there and wait for those cards to come out. And that leads me to the alien thing, because if you're like, okay, well, I should put away my aliens, right? It's worth 3 points. Why bother? It's only vulnerable there. You just keep using it. So then it's just like, okay, I have plenty of time. There's no stress or urgency involved with deciding when to put those in, which would have been the most interesting part of the game. Is like, all right, do I protect it and put it away now, or do I hold on to it? But if you leave it out there in your pile, not only is it not doing anything for you, your space dandy can just get destroyed, and then you lose it, and you lose points. And once you get too far down in this game, you'll never come back. The snowball effect in this game of, again, the cards that are just total bombs that you can buy really cheaply. There's 2 cards that give you free cards every time you play them from Orbit, and they only cost 3 and 5 stars respectively. One's better than the other. Once you get those, your opponent's done. You can get every card that you want, and you'll never have to worry about it ever again. And the alien you want, put away your aliens. Who cares? Because you got tons more. So then the other player or players really. Our first game of this was with 2, and even that was unbearable. With more players, it would just feel even longer. But once someone or a couple of players are ahead, the rest of the players are just sitting there like, can we just end this? When will my misery end? And the other problem is that, again, just like with the planet side thing, for all of the bells and whistles, for all the different types of cards and the planet side abilities and the hand abilities, and there's some neat cards that affects the orbit, like if this card's in orbit, it affects other cards around it. For all of those bells and whistles, it's just a very boring game. There was never any, because of how long it is, because of how anticlimactic it is, with one player clearly decimating the other opponents, there's just nothing exciting or fun about it. So I like some of the ideas that they had. It could have been implemented in a better way. There's a good game buried in there, but I would never play this over any other deck builder I've played, even the most generic of deck builders, because at least those end quickly. This is Space Dandy, the Galactic deck building game from 7 Seas Games. Total pass. Not a good first game from them. I have hope for the future.
Thanks for watching. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon. And make sure to check out our sponsor, Board Game Bliss, where you can find an amazing selection of games from around the world. BoardGameBliss.com. Thanks for your support.